Good morning, everyone watching from here in the US, and good afternoon to those who are tuning in from Germany and other European countries. Welcome to the Atlantic Council Europe Center's public event on debriefing Germany's federal elections, which, as we all know, happened on Sunday, February 23rd. It's 2 days after the elections, and we are convening this expert discussion to assess the results, look at their implications for Germany and the transatlantic community going forward. We're going to talk about things like foreign policy priorities for the next government, support for Ukraine, Europe's security architecture, the rise of the far right, Germany's economic outlook, China, you name it. And we have, I think one of the most interesting panels that we could have put together for this conversation. We have Mr. Noah Barkin, who is a senior advisor for the China practice of the Rhodium Group, also a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, has a China newsletter that if you aren't already subscribed to, you should definitely be subscribed to. It's great. Miss Stephanie Bolton, who's the North America editor here in DC for the German publication Welt. We have Dr. Liana Fix, who is a fellow for Europe here in Washington at the Council on Foreign Relations. Miss Elizabeth Zarofsky, who's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, focuses a lot on the rise of the far right and has a book coming out on this topic in Europe. And then Mr. Jörn Fleck, who is the senior director for the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. So thank you all for joining us, and thanks to the audience for tuning in. We have about an hour and 15 minutes, and I definitely want to get to some audience questions. And in order to do that, go to askac.org. That's askac.org, and submit your questions. And then I have one of my colleagues that is messaging me these questions, so I have them right here. I can look at and see them come in as you send them. So thank you so much, everyone. And I want to get right to it. So with that, Jorn, I want to turn to you, and then Stephanie, I'll turn to you because you're both here in Washington and can kind of give us the DC view of what we saw on Sunday in Germany. So Jorn, turning to you first, obviously you've covered this stuff for a long time, both at the Atlantic Council and other places as well. What were you looking at on Sunday? What do the outcomes of this election portend, not just for Germany, but the U.S.-German relationship as well? What are you watching from here in Washington?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with everyone. Look, I think what we saw, some key takeaways from the election result on Sunday night are clearly a rightward shift in that vote in the German political spectrum. The big winners being one, the CDU-CSU, placing first, so the center-right mainstream conservatives, and the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, a right-wing extremist party on the far right, coming in second and nearly doubling their results compared to 2021. Here, I think the CDU and its leader, Friedrich Merz, have done a good job of really presenting this as a major victory, even though the party underperformed against polling, which in Germany is pretty reliable, by 2-3 percentage points. And the party had its second worst result in its post-war history. And so there, little asterisks. I think clearly the biggest winners from the election night and the outcome are the AfD on the far right, winning the second largest parliamentary group, second largest voting share, and being now the largest opposition party in the new Bundestag. And that means something in parliamentary business, and we can come to that later on, and we'll see how the AfD will instrumentalize and leverage that role. The surprise winners, I think the left party, that not just made it across the 5% threshold that exists in German elections for federal and state parliaments, but also outperforming by sort of 2-3% the polling. And we can see a huge bump thanks to the youth vote for that party. And in the discussion, I'm sure Elizabeth will also have an opinion on that, where that maybe came from. Many would say from Friedrich Merz's and CDU's late campaign move to introduce a parliamentary measure on migration that sort of created a counter mobilization because it used AfD votes to get the vote through. We can discuss that. The biggest losers, I think, clearly the center-left Social Democrats, their worst result since I think the 1880s. Yeah. Dropping almost 10% compared to 2021. We'll see how they now fare in renewing the party from what is most likely going to be government as a junior partner to the CDU-CSU. Look, I think the outlook is generally a difficult one. Yes, we have only two parties, a two-party coalition is possible between the CDU-CSU alliance and the SPD because some other parties didn't make it into the Bundestag. But I think we should all be aware when we talk about a fresh start and what Friedrich Merz can mean for German policy at the national level, at the European level, and in terms of the transatlantic partnership. I think we should all be keenly aware that the next government will very much face the similarly enormous and immediate challenges that the previous government or the outgoing government faced. And that is a very difficult economic outlook with Germany in the second year of a recession and no easy solutions there because of international and domestic pressures. A very challenging fiscal and budgetary outlook. And the big question here is what, if anything, a CDU-led government is willing to do on the so-called debt brake in the German constitution. That's a big question. I'm sure we'll touch on that in the discussion. And then also Germany as a security actor with the German armed forces being in the sorry state that they are and no overnight fixes here. That link also back to the economic and the fiscal issues. I think I'll stop here. I hope that's enough sort of table setting in terms of what we've seen on Sunday night and a quick summary of key takeaways, and really look forward to colleagues' perspectives.
Thank you, Jorn. With that, Stephanie, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, you're covering this stuff from Washington, and I remember pretty clearly after Olaf Scholz was elected, he and Biden had this press conference. I think it was just a couple of months after his election where they stood next to each other and Biden proclaimed, the health of the U.S.-German relationship, talked about how close the two leaders were to one another, really lauded Germany for its movement on Ukraine. Liana, I'll come to you on that in a little bit, but that's not what we've heard from Washington in terms of the U.S.-German relationship in general. Trump did tweet some congratulatory notes to the CDU. I wonder if he meant to tweet that to the AfD. I'm not sure. But watching this stuff from Washington, how do you see the U.S.-German relationship developing, and what would you expect the U.S. administration's sort of relationship with this incoming Chancellor Friedrich Merz to be like? We also saw Elon Musk. And we've seen Elon Musk sort of tweet about support for the far right. Lots going on here. So just dive into whatever part of that you think is the most interesting.
Yeah, there's indeed a lot to talk about. And first of all, thanks for having me on this panel. I think, first of all, it's really important to say or to emphasize what Jörn just said, that the result is disappointing for the CDU, not so much for the CSU, but it's disappointing for the CDU, and it is for Friedrich Merz, because if you looked at the polls before the election, there was a capacity, so to say, of up to 44% that the CDU-CSU could have won, and then 28.5% is rather weak. So the feeling before the election was pretty much doom and gloom and tension, and it hasn't really changed since Sunday night. There was a lot of nervousness on Sunday night about whether the BSW, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, would make it into parliament, because that passed the 5% threshold, because that would have meant that Friedrich Merz would have then had to go into a three-party coalition. And the experience of the last a bit more than 3 years of three-party coalition wasn't very good. It was the reason why actually we now have a snap election, which, being German, that's something like, oh no, we don't do that actually. That already tells you we would have had regular election in September 2025, having the elections right now at the beginning of the year. And on top of this, in the situation of Donald Trump having won, if you cast your mind back, Trump won the election, and the next day the German government imploded. So it tells you a lot about the transatlantic relationship, how important the transatlantic relationship is, especially for Germany. And I'm sure that my colleagues, the defense experts, will talk about that in depth in a while. But how poorly prepared Germany is, how long Germany has reluctantly looked into building up capabilities in defense and security. So it is what I found striking was Friedrich Merz coming out on Sunday night in one of these TV rounds and saying this stark sentence. I mean, I personally was, I wouldn't say shocked, but I was really surprised by him saying, well, we have to become much more independent, almost comparing what is coming out of Moscow to what is coming out from Washington, really, directing this at Donald Trump and saying we must become independent now, or the Europeans must become independent. At a time where, of course, the next morning, only a few hours later, Emmanuel Macron is here or was here in Washington. And excuse me, on Thursday, Keir Starmer is here in Washington, and it's all about what is going to happen with Ukraine. How can Europe become more independent and capable of providing security to Ukraine, but also providing security to Europe herself? And that's the big challenge. We will touch on the issue of the debt brake, which Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, has already come out and said this has to be an exemption. We need to rethink the debt brake on this. In terms of relationships between the CDU and the Trump administration, and say the MAGA circles, there are some, I would definitely say they are better than the Social Democrats had links and relationships with the Trump administration. For example, Jens Spahn, the former health secretary, is said to have a good relationship to Rick Grenell. You have seen in the recent months and years a lot of CDU politicians coming also to the Atlantic Council and having good relationships and contacts on the Hill. So I think in that sense, there is a more positive outlook and more reason to think there might be some contacts that will be helpful. But it is a massive challenge. And again, it's kind of Friedrich Merz barks very loudly, but can he now also bite?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And yeah, I think everyone was really shocked to hear his comments at this roundtable on Sunday talking about, things like independence from the United States and a real pessimistic outlook for the NATO summit in June as well. So maybe we can get into that in the conversation. But Elizabeth, I wanted to come to you to sort of build on these comments that have been made by, Jorn and Stephanie already on not only the rise of the AfD, which, this is a party that was created back in 2013, got 9% in the 2021 election, and came out of this election with almost 20%. I mean, that's a huge increase. So what have you been seeing in your reporting that could maybe explain this? But also, we saw a big outcome for the left as well. So these sort of fringe parties that are now very much, I would say, part of the mainstream political conversation. So yeah, build on that a little bit if you would for us. Let's see, you might want to unmute yourself a little bit.
Better.
There we go. Yeah, we can hear you.
So there have been different responses to the AfD's impressive, performance over the weekend. But I think it's a mistake to underestimate it. I think it's a huge success for them, especially if you consider that during the federal elections 4 years ago, or almost 4 years ago at this point, I think they got somewhere around 10%. So they doubled their score. And of course, in that time, in the last 4 years, a lot has happened. Notably, the invasion of Ukraine, but also, sort of increasing pressure on the immigration issue. And in particular, in the last couple of months, of course, there have been a number of, very high profile incidents involving people, crimes perpetrated by, by people with migration background in Germany. And, whether or not these are somehow representative or proportionate of this population, I think is in some ways, it's unfortunate, but in some ways beside the point when we get to the matter of perception, because the matter of perception is that, that it's getting all sorts of media attention and that kind of thing. So that has certainly boosted the AfD's fortunes for sure. And then, I mean, in terms of looking at why they're gaining in popularity, of course, there are various breakdowns in the vote in the AfD vote, both geographically and by age. So of course, we've probably all seen this map at this point that shows, where the former East German former line between West and East Germany used to run, and that most of East Germany voted majority for AfD, and then you have pockets of sort of AfD votes in former West Germany, and so that and then you have. So last fall, actually, during the state elections in Germany, I was going out in Brandenburg, which is part of former East Germany, and going to AfD rallies then, and trying to speak with a number of AfD voters. And you find a real breakdown among young voters who are voting for the AfD and older voters who are voting for the AfD. And so when you speak to younger voters who are voting for the AfD, a lot of times it's men, of course, there's a gender breakdown as well. And a lot of times they have sort of one single response to any question, why are you here? Why are you interested? What's drawing you to this party? And they'll say immigration. And this is kind of an interesting response coming, in a part of Germany that has not had high levels of migration. Of course, if you go out, I was out in these small towns, outside of Berlin. There is some migration there, but not a huge amount. But there's this perception, and it's of course being boosted by the AfD, that our country is not ours anymore. It's being taken away from us. There's this question of jobs, and of course, part of that is that AfD is they're very adept at social media campaigns in a way that probably other more mainstream traditional parties are not, with the exception of Die Linke, which becomes another story. And then when you talk to older voters who are at these rallies, immigration is certainly part of the part of what they're concerned about, but there are other sort of factors, other kind of there are sort of emotional issues in terms of feelings of disappointment about how things have turned out in the former East Germany. But of course, the Ukraine war is a big deal in this area as well. And so you have a kind of interesting situation in which people in that part of the country are often very against getting involved in Ukraine, and there have been these Monday marches, which was something that started during the pandemic, when people would come out and protest against lockdowns, against vaccines, and that sort of thing, and they sort of transformed into marches against other issues, and in the last couple of years they've become Monday marches for peace. Right. And so whatever we take that to mean, there's clearly not necessarily a lot of kind of coherence in it, but there's this idea that former East German, people in former East Germany don't want to be involved in war with Russia. They want peace. They don't want to be in Ukraine, that kind of thing. And so obviously the AfD, plays to those sort of issues of not being involved in war efforts against Russia, as does Die Linke to a certain extent, and I haven't even touched on economy issues, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. And we'll get back into the economy issues for sure. Before we get into Ukraine and China, we turn to Liana and Noah. I did want to come back to Jorn on one thing. I mentioned this when I was asking my question to Stephanie about this comment that Friedrich Merz had made at his roundtable, or not his roundtable, but multiple potential chancellor candidates roundtable on Sunday about independence from the United States. I don't know if this is something that the AfD and the left have talked a lot about, or if that's something that speaks to the German public, or if what he said is just in response to the comments that have been made by JD Vance and Trump and Pete Hegseth at his first visit to NATO a few weeks ago. So kind of where would you place these comments that Friedrich Merz made, and how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think Stephanie already alluded to that, right? That it was very surprising coming from Friedrich Merz, who's sort of committed transatlanticist, chaired the Atlantic Book as sort of the premier U.S.-German platform in Germany, that has worked in American business, has a background there, and so that was a very stark. Those were very stark comments. I do think it's sort of a combination of factors. I think part of it is an emotional response to what we saw for 10 days or 2 weeks from President Trump and the Trump administration's moves on sort of a settlement vis-a-vis Russia's war in Ukraine, the calling into question of the alliance and U.S. commitments to European security, the JD Vance speech, and much more that had built up. And Merz was also in his Munich Security Conference panel spent the first 3 of 4 opening points on a rebuttal to Vance in many ways, and a rebuttal to the Trump administration's various and sometimes conflicting statements. And so from a transatlanticist, I think it's sort of part that emotional reaction. Partly it does play well in Germany, that there is a sort of some level of anti-Americanism that has been fanned by the Trump administration's return and its positions. I do think after 2 weeks of a hammering of Europe or a shutting out of Europe, it would also be in that forum calling into question U.S. commitments to European security. It would also be grossly negligent of a future German chancellor not to consider options in making sure that Germany and the next German government can protect its core national interests without reliance on a seemingly unreliable ally in Washington, D.C. So I think it's a careful balance. I think the European framing speaks to the other big part of Merz's identity, and that's a committed European. And there, I think we can be a bit more hopeful on the EU stage. I think that the downside of those comments are clearly, it risks fueling or fanning anti-American sentiment. This equivalence between Washington and Russia, even though we might be emotionally inclined to react that way, is, I think, out of proportion for now. And then most importantly, a Trump administration might just take him by his word if he says we need to become independent. Given previous statements on U.S. commitment to NATO and the like, maybe President Trump decides to say, go right ahead, knock yourself out. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I think there could be a smarter framing, and Merz and the next government, I think, need to think really hard about how they engineer a fresh start in relations with Washington and the Trump administration. And there's some stuff to work with, but there are also continuing barriers and challenges to that.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. Okay, so I want to turn the conversation east, not just to Europe, but also to Ukraine and to China. And with that, I want to turn over to Liana and Noah to give us a breakdown of what they see developing on these topics. Liana, I want to start with you. I mean, you've written a ton for many publications. If the folks watching haven't read Liana's stuff, especially in foreign affairs on the Ukraine war, definitely worth going to read. How do you, I mean, one thing that we have heard is, there's this understanding that Germany needs to be more forward-leaning, both as a member of NATO, as a member of Europe's security architecture, but also in terms of its support for Ukraine, because without the United States, and it certainly doesn't appear that the United States is going to continue its Ukraine support. Negotiations seem to be happening. I mean, there's a ton here. So how do you see Germany playing into the outcome of potential negotiations, support for a potential ceasefire? A lot that you can dig into, and I would welcome any part of that you want to draw out you think is the most important.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. That's a great conversation. Wonderful to be with so many fantastic analysts here. Let me say that there are two issues that are at play now when it comes to Ukraine, but also Germany's take on that. First of all, Europeans and Germans have been confused at the beginning what exactly Trump's stance on Ukraine would be, right? I mean, there's so many conflicting interpretations flying around. Oh, it's about pulling Russia away from China. It's about being a peacemaker. It can be more productive because Trump can exert pressure on Russia. What we see now, especially with more meetings in Saudi Arabia coming up, is that the clear goal, we do have some clarity by now, and these meetings in Saudi Arabia do show that the goal of all what Trump is doing in Ukraine is not Ukraine. It's not to just end the war, to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The aim of this is to normalize US-Russian relations. That's the clear pathway. It explains everything. It explains so much of that, which is confusing. Why the Saudi Arabia framework, why the vote in the United Nations, and so on. It all makes sense if you look at this from a perspective of US-Russia normalization, business deals with Russia, whether they make economically sense or not, and Ukraine is a caveat, kind of a problem that you have to overcome, which from Trump's perspective is also not a huge problem to overcome, because in principle he does agree with President Putin that Ukraine is part of Russia's sphere of influence. That's how one can explain his comments about why have the Ukrainians started this war. It's basically the assumption that they could have just accepted that they are in Russia's sphere of influence, will remain there, and we would not have seen this war, right? I mean, that's, if you extrapolate his statements, that's where this ends. And for Europeans and for Germany, there would have been an opportunity to, sneakily lean into this Trump approach, to officially and rhetorically oppose it, but in the end to say, well, I mean, if Trump is throwing Ukraine under the bus, we better defend our security, sort of Poland's eastern border than Ukraine's western border, right? And to kind of say, we're going to support Ukraine, but that's it. Now, with Trump's comments and Hex's comments about NATO and European security, that is not an option anymore. It's not an option to follow Trump's line of selling out Ukraine, not officially, but kind of, somehow following it, to save your own skin and to save NATO, right? Now it's very clear that these two issues are interlinked, that if Ukraine comes under the bus, NATO and European security are also up for grabs. And that is something which is good for Ukraine, because it makes the Europeans and Germans realize that Ukraine's security is linked to Europe's security, in Trump's thinking and in their own thinking. And it is good because this whole debate that we had under Olaf Scholz in the German election campaign, how can we support Ukraine but not support it too much? How can you be a peace chancellor and at the same time support Ukraine without wanting Ukraine to win? This whole ambiguous kind of wishy-washy debate by Olaf Scholz has now gotten some clarity, that support for Ukraine is something that is closely tied to Germany's own security. Now coming back with this long introduction to Friedrich Merz's position. So he always has been more hawkish than Olaf Scholz has been on the Taurus missiles. He has very clearly said Ukraine must win this war. He, with his Western integration, NATO, European socialization and upbringing, he understands what is at stake in Ukraine. But from his perspective, the crucial question will be to decide what is it that Europeans have to do in Ukraine. Is it to be part of negotiations, to increase the leverage, to make things better? Or is it to support Ukraine in a way that in the worst case, Ukraine is able to say no to an imposed deal by Trump and Putin, right? And those are two different things, right? Either you try to make the negotiations that Trump is conducting better, or you try to strengthen Ukraine in a way that allows Ukraine and Europeans to say no. It's a risky game to do the latter, because if you basically say we support Ukraine to say no, and if it says no, we accept that, even if it means a continuation of the war, because obviously this will draw the ire of Donald Trump if Ukrainians and Europeans refuse the imposition of a ceasefire agreement. What we've heard from Wittkopf, that it could be based on the Istanbul negotiations from early the war, are completely outrageous. I mean, they're sort of hitting all the red flags, the size of Ukraine's military, domestic interference into Ukraine. I mean, if that's the framework, it's unacceptable to Ukraine and to Europeans. So that's a decision that Friedrich Merz has to take. And what he needs to do for that is to have the financial firepower to support Ukraine, to strengthen Europe's defense. We see this, with the special fund that he's trying to get through, another 200 billion special fund that he's trying to get through this parliament. But the crucial decisions that he will have to make on Ukraine are twofold. First, Russian frozen assets. Europeans have to decide, and have to decide fast, whether they're going to seize Russian frozen assets, because Hungary has already announced that it's going to veto in the next discussions, some parts of sanctions and so on. The Russian frozen assets, if they're vetoed once, they go back to Russia. They are gone. Like, this whole huge fund is gone, right? It's a huge risk, and we are like, I don't know how many months, 3 or 4 months away from the next round of sanctions. So that's a decision that they have to take very quickly to seize those assets, make sure they don't go back to Russia, which will also increase Europe's leverage, because they can say to the United States and to Ukraine, we have enough money to support Ukraine for a long time here, right? Even if it's just 150 billion that are there on the European side. And the second question that Merz will have to decide is, what is he going to do about the European mission, right? I mean, France and the UK are going ahead with planning that. We saw Macron in the White House trying to get an approval and an American backing for that. He was relatively successful, but again, the question is, how much is it worth if Trump says in one moment in the White House he's going to back that? I mean, what are you going to do once you stand in Ukraine and he says, oh no, that's not what I meant? And the other part is, Friedrich Merz will probably adopt the typical German approach of wait and see how things are sort of shaping up, what exactly the proposal is going to be, and then contributing something from the German side without being sort of in the front line. And it makes sense, because again, the deterrence that Germany as a non-nuclear power can provide is less than the deterrence in the UK and France can provide. But he needs to contribute significantly to a European mission if it takes place, because otherwise his ambition to have Germany present on the European international stage will not be credible. And for that, he will have to convince the Germans that Bundeswehr troops in Ukraine are useful. We have, I think the last opinion poll said that actually more Germans support that than not, but it's very, very close. So it's like a 50-50 thing right now with the Germans, but it's a difficult case to make. So these are the two things that he will have to decide on Ukraine very quickly: Russian frozen assets, European mission, and then of course accelerating Ukraine's EU integration process. That's the last step that he needs to push for on Ukraine.
So a lot there. Stephanie, I might turn back to you for a second just to build on this a little from a perspective where you're covering this from the US. I mean, it seems like what Liana is suggesting will require the incoming chancellor and potential coalition partners or partner to expend a lot of political capital. I mean, these are risky things, and the German public is sort of there, but still very tepid or nervous about how deeply Germany should get involved in this. I mean, do you see Merz and these coalition conversations I mean, being able to be this forward-leaning in terms of the German role that would be required in a future, support for Ukraine, but also Ukraine's future in the European Union?
I mean, I wished Merz and then also supposedly the new Social Democratic junior partner then, because the Social Democrats will be in the role of the junior partner, they will be also forward-leaning. But knowing Germany, usually this is not how it works. Again, it really depends who will be now the head of the SPD in that coalition, and if it is, which looks like Boris Pistorius, who has been a very respected and very popular defense minister, and actually was also in the race to, there was, if you remember, maybe it was back in, was it November, where there was talk that he might even replace Olaf Scholz as the Spitzenkandidat. So if that was kind of the duo at the head of the German government, Friedrich Merz and Boris Pistorius, you could think that these two together might push forward a very defiant and self-confident and kind of, I mean, a lot of people, it's interesting, there's almost a yearning for those days back in at the end of the 80s when Helmut Kohl just decided, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go for German reunification, and I'm not going to ask people around me, because the Germans are very, you know, that we are very, we like security, we like safety, we don't like risks. And this is it's a situation now where you actually, as the responsible chancellor and the government, you have to take risks now and take the German people with you. And that, I think, is also a question very much of communication. But then don't forget, there's also the AfD and the Linke, which was, very surprising that they got they were so successful. Together, they actually have a blocking minority. So if you look, for example, at the debt break, and this would acquire probably a constitutional change, these two parties together, which are on the very left extreme and on the right extreme, they could block it. So if the Linke has said, actually, they will be constructive, they want to help, but in return, then Merz has to give them a lot. And what does he have to give them? And in the end, it always comes down to money. It comes down to social welfare. It's a massive challenge. But as I said, I think there is so much at stake, and there is high expectations what Merz has to achieve. He has very little time. He might only have 4 years, and then the AfD might win the next election. The expectations are massive, and he has to take risks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this is a really good segue into the part of our conversation where we can really get into the German economy. And Noah, I want to talk to you or turn to you to kick us off on this part of the conversation. China is such a major part of this conversation, and the interconnectedness of Germany's economy with China, Germany's sluggish economy. I mean, it's just not growing. There's tension between the German business industry and German politicians. The automotive industry is slow and sluggish. So, how are you seeing the potential relationship between Germany and China developing? What are you going to be watching closely, both on this specific thing, but also what that portends for the German economy writ large? And feel free to touch on the debt break if you want to as well, but I'll get into that conversation, I think, in the next round also.
Sure. Well, Rachel and Jörn, thanks for having me. Good to see all the familiar faces. I think you're absolutely right that the German economy has in the past depended heavily on China, but I think we are entering a sort of new phase. First of all, the Chinese economy is slowing. Second of all, trade barriers are rising. So Germany does need to rethink this relationship, and I think one change that I think we are going to see with Friedrich Merz is just a change of tone. We talked about this in relation to the U.S. and Merz's comments on election night about not being able to depend on the U.S. I actually thought this was a good message. I think I'm so sick of Olaf Scholz's kind of wishy-washy messages about the transatlantic relationship is existential. We can't, you know, the U.S. will remain committed to NATO. We can't do without the U.S. in Ukraine. I think it was time for a sort of a shift in messaging, to be honest, because I think these messages are too divorced from reality, the ones that have been coming from Scholz. And on China, Merz has been quite outspoken. He gave his big foreign policy speech at the Kober Stiftung a few weeks ago and talked about an axis of autocracies with China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. He didn't put the U.S. in that group. Maybe that will change, but you know, also he talked about warned German companies about investing in China, saying they come with big risks, these investments. So I think we are going to get a change of tone. There is, Stephanie noted, you know, Merz barks loudly. Is he going to bite? I think there is a legitimate question there, but he's sending the right messages. I think he's talking about a whole of government approach. He's been very critical of all the infighting in the outgoing government. He's talking about introducing a national security council that would coordinate foreign and security policy. He's talking about boosting in Europe. He's talking about boosting relations with France, with Poland. He's from the same party as Ursula von der Leyen in the European Commission president. So I think, you know, the proof will be in the pudding. We'll have to see, but I think he's sending the right messages on China. I think that all said, you know, if you look at the priority list of the next German government, it's getting the economy running again. It's ramping up defense spending. It's dealing with immigration. And I think in the first months, it will be getting a budget for 2025 together. So there is a risk that China gets pushed down the priority list, certainly in the short term, but China isn't going away. And I think we do have an opportunity for maybe a bit more German leadership within Europe on China policy. I think over the past 3 years under the Ampel, the traffic light coalition, Olaf Scholz, we've had Germany sort of clashing with its European partners on China. I think Europe really needs to figure out for itself what it wants from this relationship. I think it's been reacting to the US in recent years quite a bit. You know, we have to keep in mind that transatlantic cooperation on China policy is likely to suffer under the Trump administration. All these dialogues, the Trade and Technology Council, EU-US dialogue on China. Trump could be pursuing a deal with Xi Jinping, heating up the phase 1 trade deal that he clinched in his first term. And so that's going to force Europe to think about what it really wants from this relationship and react and stop reacting to what the US is pushing. So I would say the glass is half full on this, just because Merz has been sending the right signals. But the challenge, especially the economic challenge, Rachel, that you mentioned, becomes much more, much bigger if you have the US hitting you with tariffs. Obviously, neither Germany nor Brussels want to be in a two-front trade war. So this is something that's going to be difficult for Europe to navigate.
You know, I love hearing that there may be a possibility to have at least a discussion about a National Security Council, because so many people have been suggesting this for so long, and all we hear from Germans are like, oh, this isn't how the German government works. This isn't what we do. This isn't how, you know, this isn't how we do things. And it's like, you know, you have to get a little bit more creative at this point on how Germany makes policy. And, you know, an extension of that is, a potential constitutional change to the debt brake. We've heard, I mean, part of the reason that the former coalition fell apart in November was tied to spending and limits on spending, and the FDP is so tied to keeping the debt brake. Obviously, there's EU laws that come into play here as well in terms of spending limits, but how do you see this developing? I mean, you need a 2/3 majority to have a constitutional change, but also it seems like there's a pretty, well-established opinion that the debt brake is limiting at this point, too limiting, and is potentially harming Germany. So how do you see this debate developing, Noah, over not just the coalition talks, but potentially the next government as well?
Well, I think there is an emerging consensus that the debt brake is no longer fit for these times. I think there has been reporting in recent days that Merz is considering using the outgoing parliament to make some changes there. Because of course the AfD and the Linke will have a blocking majority in the new parliament. So we'll see if that works. But I think Merz didn't want to come out before the election and say I want to get rid of the debt brake. But I think he's been pretty clear that he doesn't. He sees this as too much of a straitjacket for Germany, given the challenges that it faces, the need to spend on defense, and just given the other economic challenges that Germany faces. So I would expect that they find a way around this. I'm not an expert on how they're going to do it, but I think the consensus is there, and we know the SPD has been calling for this. So I would expect that Merz would find an open door there when it comes to some of the other parties in parliament.
Okay, thanks. Elizabeth, I wanted to turn to you on the question of the economy. I mean, you've gone out and talked to voters who feel like the center left and the center right not only don't represent them, but that the German economy is in such dire straits that it has now affected their own livelihoods, which has then created a scenario where they feel like they have to vote for parties that are on the fringes. I mean, you also talked a little bit about far right and far left messaging, but there's also just facts on the ground. If the economy is doing better, if people feel like it's doing better, then maybe we can bring them back from the fringes. I don't know. It's just sort of like me working through this in real time. But do you think that this is part of the conversation here when it comes to the far right? And how do you think that Schultz and this potential new coalition might be able to focus on the economy to a point where it can bring people back to the center a bit?
Yeah, it's definitely part of the equation. And I think those are really interesting questions, not just for the AfD, but sort of for votes for far right parties in many parts of the world. So of course, it's very easy. If you drive outside of Berlin into the countryside, into Brandenburg, you see AfD posters all over the place that say, okay, heat prices are too high. And of course, there is an energy crisis in Germany, and, rents are too high, and all of these sort of bread and butter financial economic issues that are, of course, a big concern, but it's easy for the AfD to say, oh, yeah, of course, we'll fix all of that, as we're seeing with Trump in the US. If you haven't been in power, it's easy to say, well, we're going to take care of that, and then less clear how they actually do take care of that if they do get into power. But it sounds nice, of course. So there's that, there's that issue. I think it's a really interesting question about whether or not actual policy solutions to these issues will bring voters back into the mainstream. So if Merz is able to bring energy prices down, if he's able to sort of solve the macroeconomic questions in Germany, will policy solutions bring, sort of solve these political issues, and bring these voters back into the fold? I mean, it's not so clear, right? I mean, we can see in the United States, the failures of the Biden administration when they were campaigning on their economic issues, and speaking directly to economic voters' concerns and their ability to point to policies that they had done to help working class voters, those messages didn't necessarily resonate with working class voters in the United States, and it didn't bring them back into the Democratic Party. And the reasons for that have to do with people voting for protest parties for emotional reasons, of course, not for policy reasons. And also, there are very strong issues of identity going on here in terms of voters who vote for far right. Far left is like a different question at this point because it's a different sort of historical context in which Die Linke is coming out of. But that people vote, especially in working class, in sort of working class areas, that people vote for parties that they have sort of social ties to, and the sort of hollowing out of areas of the country in Germany, especially, and the presence of parties in local areas means that a lot of people for example, in former East Germany, don't necessarily have immediate social ties to sort of party organizations in the way that exists in West Germany. So, will policy solutions bring voters back to the mainstream parties? I think that's a good question. And then there's a very sort of interesting question that I have come across in my own reporting as well, which is, if we're talking about sort of increasing military spending and increasing defense production in Germany, you have these issues also with AfD voters, especially in former East Germany. I was out in Görlitz, which is a town right on the Polish border, a couple of weeks ago, and they are having a sort of controversy right now because there's a former Alstom plant that was producing train carriages that is in the process of being transformed into a factory that will produce parts for tanks, actually. And the voters in that area are very, there's a lot of controversy about that. They're very unhappy about that. They don't necessarily want to be involved in a war economy, in a war production economy, even though, it would, that's part of both sort of German defense and national security policy, and it would be also potentially a good thing for the industry, the growth of industry in the area. So these are very, very complicated situations here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super interesting. And Liana, I want to come to you on this because I think it speaks to, I think you can extrapolate that specific example and potentially apply it to the German population writ large, where, Olaf Scholz gave this speech a few days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, talking about the Zeitenwende, this historical turning point. Now, I think that what he meant to say is probably different than how this phrase has developed over the last few years. I think it's turned into something potentially much bigger than he anticipated, which means it's been hard for Germany to keep up with expectations. Because this Zeitenwende requires a shift of thinking for not just the government, but how the German population thinks of itself in terms of, not just Germans, but also members of NATO, members of the EU, supporters of, foreign conflict. So how do you, I mean, it's a sort of a broad question, and you can kind of touch on it however you like, but do you think that the German mindset has shifted at all in the last few years in terms of, not just shifting to a potential war economy, but shifting in terms of, Germany's role in security and defense issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would answer that Germany's mindset has shifted away from something, but has not shifted to something. So the German mindset has shifted away from civilian power. It has shifted away from military restraint. It has shifted away from this myth of being a pacifist power that Germany has kind of upheld since 1945. Somehow, we are the better peace-loving Germans, and as Thomas Bagger wrote, history is bending our ways. So that's gone, and you see no one who is repeating these claims apart from sort of the populist left wing and right wing. Well, the right wing not, they want a nationalization and militarization of Germany for a go-it-alone foreign policy, but the left wing is kind of still serving this peace narrative. So that's gone. But there's nothing new that Olaf Scholz has put into place. So the only attempt that he has made to create something new has been this weird foreign affairs article that he has written, where he talked about Germany in a multipolar world, which is a German euphemism for, oh, please, let's give us a role in this, competitive world, which was also sugarcoating China's role as, just another pole, like the US and Russia and Europe is one pole, right? I mean, completely confusing outlook on the world, completely confused analysis of where the world is headed. And for Friedrich Merz, it's easier because now you can't be confused anymore where the world is headed. It's pretty clear. I mean, there's no way how you can still talk about multipolarity, right? I mean, the US is shifting away from the West. And they might come back. I mean, this might not be the new normal in US foreign policy. That's fine. But the shock is big enough for that the German mindset should be able at this point to shift to something new. And for Merz, it's easier to have this new because he can throw out Europe as the answer to this new, right? He can throw out European military power, which always makes it easier for Germans to also accept German power. So they're always very skeptical German military leadership role in opinion polls, but they love European military. It sounds just so much better if it has like a European coating to it. And that's something that Merz can offer now as a new something that fills the hole in the self-identity that Germany had in the last years. And it doesn't help that everyone, has been bashing Germany for Germany got it all wrong, all wrong with China, all wrong with Russia. Everything is broken. The business model is broken. It's not anymore an export championship. That might be true in the analysis, but for Germans who love to be right and who love to be on the right side of history, it's a lot to swallow if suddenly everything is wrong that they've ever done, right? The economic policy, the foreign policy, the security policy. And that's not something that you can build a new identity on, right? So I don't want to talk too long because we're coming to the end, but again, it needs a positive view of, even if things were wrong in the past, what's the new thing that we are heading to? What's a new positive identity that we can get? And here, if Merz is becoming a goalist now, and perhaps we are all becoming goalists now, that's a trend of the time, then this is something that you can sell to the German public as the new positive vision, European process of self-independence where Germany's military power will have a role. We need to find a nice term for that, but I'm not good at this. Someone will find this.
Someone will give a speech, someone will come up with a word, I'm sure. Jorn, I wanted to come to you. I mean, we have about 15 minutes, and just for the audience that's watching, again, submit your questions to askac.org. I have a couple here already that I'll get to in just a second. But Jorn, would just come to you for your reactions on the question I posed to Liana, but also, anything else in the conversation that you wanted to extrapolate on and build upon.
Yeah, look, really interesting comments from everyone. I think I would try to connect a couple of things that Stephanie, Liana, even Elizabeth and Noah pointed out. I think this lack of in this campaign, when there's a general sense of frustration with the state of affairs on the economy, on migration as the two big drivers, on the sense of sort of general decline and conversation about how viable social welfare systems are, and big questions there that sort of escape the foreign perception of this debate, of this campaign. There wasn't really a clear narrative or vision from any one party that would say, here's how things need to fundamentally change, and this is where we want to take Germany in a foreseeable future, right? On a realistic, whatever it is, 5-10-year timeline. And that was completely missing from the domestic, the economic, the foreign policy debate from pretty much all parties, I think. And that links back to, for example, Stephanie talked about sort of a much needed conversation with the German public about why the Russia's war in Ukraine matters and why a potential settlement that over the heads of the Ukrainians and the Europeans really will impact Germany and Europe directly. You know, I always think when I hear these polling numbers about are Germans for troops or against, are Germans for a stronger military against, on foreign and defense policy issues, that public opinion can be shaped by leadership, right? It's not like a values-based or infused social issue where, you know, it's a much more complex and entrenched position that many people have. And here, the outgoing government and the chancellor especially have completely failed. Liana already hinted at, Noah said it, you know, you're sick and tired of these sort of generalist statements about the importance of the transatlantic partnership. Exactly. Like, spell out where Germany needs to go. And, you know, one comment on German independence or greater European independence is not enough, but it is an opportunity to reframe this. And while I think, you know, yes, you can understand that as a goalless position, I think Merz is still pretty far from that. I think reading the Zelensky speech, for example, from Munich, where sort of peace through European strength that he outlined almost, right? I think that will also attract American and the Trump administration interest. That's a much smarter way forward. And I think that's probably ultimately also much closer to where Merz comes from and where you can talk to at least the mainstream Democratic parties and the mainstream of German public opinion. I think that's really important. I think I totally agree with Elizabeth, this sort of debate of whether deliverism is enough, right? You just address the economy and you just address migration and a couple social policy issues, and then all those AfD swing voters to the AfD will finally come back. I think it also links back to this lack of a clear narrative and vision in German politics of where we want to take, where the next leadership wants to take Germany. And, you know, that should directly relate to this, because it's not enough to just deliver on these issues. I would also say, you know, important in that respect, and I'll stop on that, is really the outlook for where this not so grand coalition between the CDU, CSU, and the SPD can take things. In my opening, I already alluded to some of the limitations that will still be there. I think priority number one that sort of helps to solve some of the other issues is addressing the economic challenges, because that links back to how dire the migration situation will be perceived. That links back to what Germany can do at a European level on defense for Ukraine, how it will be perceived by a Trump administration, right? As an economic powerhouse, or as sort of this, you know, near socialist, sort of, you know, crumbling sclerotic economy in Europe. And there, I think there's some big question marks of how the CDU and CSU and the SPD come together on, okay, the debt break, maybe there's some muddling through there with some greater flexibility. Noah already talked about the limitations because of constitutional majorities that there are. But on tax reforms, where the CDU has sort of put an emphasis, corporate tax, depreciation, income tax, the CDU and the SPD aren't exactly near in terms of their positions. On industrial policy, on climate policies, on social welfare policies, we're seeing some real differences there. And Merz knows he doesn't have much time to form that government, but, you know, that we will see whether this threat from the AfD and the fringe parties that have almost a third of, or have over a third of the seats in the next Bundestag will be enough of a disciplining factor on getting those positions aligned, and then also getting some quick action. I mean, I think Merz is very envious of President Trump's executive order, push in the first few weeks. A German chancellor doesn't have that power in a parliamentary system, but we'll see. The next German government will have to move relatively quickly on all of these issues. I'll stop here.
Yeah. No, I think I mean, a lot of what you said, I totally agree with, especially on the point you made on this idea of deliverism. And that's not what works for people. And I think what we see also in the United States with the rise of this, like the new right, is they're not saying that we'll deliver better for you. They pull on people's emotions. And it's like, not only do people in Washington and Berlin look down on you, but they don't like you. We do. We are the voice of you and we support you. And so it goes to something that's so much deeper than just the economy or immigration or energy. Like it goes into the deep emotions for how people relate to themselves and as part of a broader community, I think. And that's a much harder thing to get to. Noah, I might come to you with a question from the audience. It's on the debt break, but I think you can kind of take this into whatever direction you'd like. It says, with the BSW, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, having split from Die Linke, would Die Linke be more inclined to support measures such as reforming the debt break with the 2/3 Bundestag majority to fund military spending or to fund other things, I guess, too? Or are its pacifist roots and Russia-friendly voices still too strong?
Yes.
Oh.
My guess is that any relaxation of the debt break in order to fund military spending, and it's pretty clear what the government or the future government intends to do in terms of defense spending, that is going to be met with opposition from the Linke and from the AfD as well. So I don't expect. I mean, we'll have to see whether changes can be made in the current parliament before everybody goes home and the coalition negotiations come to fruition and a new parliament comes in. But I think I think coming back, maybe a slight deviation. I think picking up on what Jörn was saying, I think if you think back, Scholz kind of modeled himself on Merkel, the ruhige Hand, the steady hand. He gave the speech 3 years ago. I think he deserves credit for giving that speech, but then he went back to steady hand mode and never presented the broader strategy and the narrative. And I think with the US security blanket now being ripped away, maybe it comes back, but if it's gone for 4 years, then you better have a plan B. And I think the big question now is does this force Europe's hand? Does it lead to bold measures, breaking of taboos in Germany? And does it lead to change in Europe? Just because Europe is being forced to change, it can no longer ignore the challenges, whether it's from the US now with the Trump administration, Russia, or China. I think, look, trying to do a critical minerals deal with Ukraine as an alternative to Trump's deal, I think that's great. I've sensed a growing debate in Europe about pushing back very hard against the Trump administration, putting 50% tariffs on Tesla or banning X or something like that. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but that is a conversation that is now happening in Europe. And I think there's a feeling if we're just going to the Trump administration and saying we're willing to give you X, Y, and Z, and we hope that you don't put tariffs on us, that's not going to work. They need to show that they're willing to hit back hard, and I think they need some positive momentum. They need a positive narrative, and that's, I think, what we've just been talking about.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to hop in on that specific question? Or I think about your answers, and then there's another question from the audience here too, that anyone can feel free to jump in on, maybe Liana or Stephanie. Since Macron was just in DC yesterday, we saw that press conference. It actually, I think, went pretty well. Do you foresee Merz visiting Washington soon? And what do you think he should or would come and present to the Trump administration? Or do we have to wait until there's a new government in place? Liana, maybe that's to you.
Happy to try. So Merz has some advantages, right? And the joke is always he doesn't like Merkel. He was the archenemy of Angela Merkel, so did Donald Trump. And I mean, if he's smart, perhaps he would bring that line just to establish like a first good relationship with Trump. But then he's a conservative. Trump has congratulated him on energy and migration agenda, so he can push that forward. He should talk about his BlackRock role, chairman of BlackRock Germany. He should talk about his role as the chairman of the Atlantic Brücke, US mega nonprofit. So he has ways to establish a personal relationship with Donald Trump. And despite everything, that's not unimportant, right? I mean, we see how Macron is playing that. It's always a question, how sustainable is it? But as our colleague Constanze Stelzmüller said, try until it's really clear that there's no chance anymore to work with the United States. Until then, you need to establish this working relationship. The problem is that Germany's trade deficit with the United States has only grown since Trump's first term. So that's something that Friedrich Merz will have to propose solutions to. Buying US weapons could be one solution, which then again, however, would contradict the idea to establish more European independence. The other way how he can proceed about that is pointing out to German investments into the United States, creating jobs, because those investments have doubled in the last 10 years. He can also point out investments into defense that Germany is planning to undertake, to make sure that this impression and this pretty strong Germany bashing that is prevalent in the Trump team kind of gets a corrective. There are many Rick Grinnell, GD Vance who have like a personal vendetta with Germany. They had a personal vendetta with the former German ambassador, with Emily Haber here, and they are obviously influencing Trump's views that Germany is still the free rider that's not providing anything. Merz will have an opportunity to correct that view. The only concern that I have is that Matt's vanity might stand in his way. He is a proud person, so he doesn't want to be treated in a way that is somehow demeaning, and Trump is very good at that. So that might be a problem. And in domestic politics, we've seen that Merz does approach a way of my way or the highway, right? I mean, that's not going to fly with Europeans, but it's also not going to fly with Donald Trump. We've seen this in the asylum debate, where he basically said, well, you either agree to my motion or I don't care. That's something that he will definitely have to tone down, his personal pride and his attempt to be stubborn on issues that he wants to push through.
Thank you. No, and what you mentioned, Rick Grinnell, former ambassador to Germany, now president of the Kennedy Center. I think maybe we just won't plan to see any German operas at the Kennedy Center anytime soon over the next 4 years. But no, to everyone, I think this was such a fantastic conversation, and I don't think we could have gathered together a better group of experts to unpack what we just saw and what to expect over the coming months. And so thank you to all of you for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Thanks to our audience for tuning in, and be sure to watch the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council closely for more analysis and events as the German coalition talks develop over the coming months. And hopefully we'll be able to have another conversation like this in the not so distant future. So to all of you, thank you. And thanks to the audience for tuning in. Bye-bye.